So welcome, everybody, to the call. My name is Andrew Park. I work with the international projects here at the Williams Institute. And the Williams Institute is an institution located within the UCLA School of Law that focuses on research and dissemination of data and information about LGBT populations throughout the world. We're going to have several speakers tonight, so I'd like to first introduce the speakers and then give some logistical instructions about how we're going to work the conference call. So one thing that I'm going to do now is I'm going to mute all of you.
The conference has been muted.
All right, so you are all muted, and that way we don't have to worry about background noises. And I'll give you instructions on how to unmute if you need to later. The first speaker that we're going to hear from on this topic, which is LGBT exclusion in Indonesia and its economic effects, is Lee Badgett. She's a Williams Distinguished Scholar at the Williams Institute and a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Then Winston Luhur, who's also a co-author of the study, will speak to us. He's a research associate here at the Williams Institute, and his studies are in the field of biological sciences. Then we'll hear from Amira Hasenbush. She's the Jim Kepner Law and Policy Fellow at the Williams Institute. And then, assuming the technology works out, we're going to hear from Dédé Oetomo, who is the National Coordinator of GAYa Nusantara. And then Tunggal Pawestri, who is a consultant in the field of women and gender rights. So before starting out with Lee Badgett, let me say that right now everybody's phones are muted. If you would like to unmute your phone, you press *6. Sorry. Sorry, I started off wrong already. If you want to unmute your phone, you press *7. And then if you want to mute your phone again, it's *6. We're going to go through all the speakers and then take questions at the end. And the questions, I'll let you know when we're doing this, can be done by unmuting your phone and asking them after all the speakers are through, or by typing the question in the comments box if you see that on your screen. And let me also say that if you know that you have hold music on your phone and you need to make another call, then just hang up, exit the conference, and then come back into the conference. What we want to do is try to avoid people using the hold button, particularly if they have hold music, and the rest of us might end up hearing it. Okay, so let me ask Lee Badgett to go ahead and start off.
Hey, am I unmuted now?
You are unmuted, yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, excellent. Okay, good. Well, thank you, Andrew, and thank you all for coming. Good morning if you're in Jakarta, and good evening if you're here in the East Coast of the U.S. We're very happy today to talk about this report that came out a couple of weeks ago on LGBT exclusion in Indonesia and its economic effects. Normally, of course, we think about LGBT exclusion from the perspective of human rights, and this is a global conversation that we're having in pretty much every country in the world. We are tonight, though, talking about this from a complementary perspective, from the perspective of thinking about how LGBT exclusion might be bad for economic outcomes. That's also a global conversation that's happening, but one that's sometimes taking place in different locations. So we wanted to do a study that would provide some context for thinking about the issue of LGBT people and how they're treated from the economic perspective in Indonesia. So I'm just going to set this up for us, and my co-authors will be, as Andrew mentioned, will be talking about this as well. We undertook this as what sometimes is called a desk study. We've largely been relying on the evidence that we can find of LGBT exclusion that comes from varying sources in Indonesia, whether it's academic research on Indonesia or whether it's work that's been done by NGOs or even in some cases government agencies. We scoured the universe and have uncovered a great deal of evidence that we'll talk about tonight or this morning that documents exclusion in Indonesia. And then secondly, alongside of that, our goal is to show how these patterns of exclusion affect the economy. And just to give you a little bit of a diagram that'll put this into some sort of context. Why do we think about this way? We think about this as economists think about how economies operate best. And at the heart of all economies are human beings. And human beings bring to the work that they do, whether it's in a household or in a formal labor market or an informal labor market, different kinds of skills, abilities, and knowledge that allow them to make contributions to the economy, to create the goods and services that other people value. We call that in economics human capital, skills, abilities, and knowledge, those three of the smaller circles that you see on the screen here. Now, each of those types of contributions, those types of human capital, are influenced by or created in certain kinds of contexts. And we're going to talk about those contexts tonight. So in particular, we're going to look at education to see how the treatment of LGBT people might affect the skills that they're able to learn. We'll look at the employment sector, which influences not just the skills that people use, but also what they learn as they gain more experience. We'll look at health, which has an impact on skills and abilities, people's ability to actually go to work as well as their ability to learn those skills and to exercise them. Violence makes a big difference in terms of people's literal ability to actually be in a place where they're creating things that are useful to the economy, as are legal barriers that might stop people from having that ability. And then the knowledge, of course, in the context of education is influenced by many things, including people's health. So these all are woven together in a way to show how the things that happen to LGBT people in the world, in Indonesia, might affect their skills, abilities, and knowledge. Now, we have to admit to start with that the ways of doing this kind of work are actually very well known to economists, to people who work in the development context, because looking at the issue of gender inequality or of inequality for people with disabilities or for people who are certain ethnic minorities, those are all groups of people who've also had this economic lens used to understand their experience. What those areas have that we do not have, however, in the LGBT context is a large body of data to draw on. In Indonesia, we found no nationwide data collection on anything about LGBT people, much less the kind of detailed, nuanced demographic data that we would need to do a very, quantitative model. Most of the numbers that we found, and indeed some of the research that you'll hear about, come in the context of the HIV epidemic, where there have been attempts to estimate the number of men who have sex with men. Not surprisingly, those estimates range very widely, from anywhere from around 1 million people who are MSMs to some community estimates of 3 million MSMs. We'll also talk about their estimates of the GAYa population, and Winston will talk about that group in just a second. Other kinds of limits of the studies that we looked at that I think that you may hear in our voices as we say, this is what we found, this is what we know, but we know this is not a complete picture. That comes because many of these studies had a narrow geographical focus. We found very little research on lesbian, bisexual women, or trans men. These studies do not come from random samples of the LGBT population, so we can't make very explicit comparisons. And quite a few of the studies that were very helpful were qualitative studies. They're helpful in understanding the situation for LGBT people, but make it difficult for us to turn this into a really clear-cut economic model. That said, those limitations aside, we did find multiple studies in each area, and I will just say that we, as I said, we combed the universe, the research universe, and looked at both studies that were done in English and in Indonesian. Winston, who you'll hear from in just a second. In fact, we'll turn things over to him to start us off in looking at some of this data. Oh, actually, no, I'm sorry. I'm going to talk about one more slide. The one exception to that rule of having very little data is it turns out there is some public opinion data that come from a couple of studies that are done by international efforts to collect data on public opinion on many subjects, and they happen to include opinions about homosexuality. So actually we'll start off this with some actual numbers and data. The Pew Global Attitude Survey, which is done in the U.S. by the Pew Research Center in many different countries, has asked in several of its studies whether people agree that homosexuality should be accepted by society. And I'm showing you the three recent surveys that were done, 2007, 2011, and 2013. And what you see is a very small number of people in Indonesia agree that homosexuality should be accepted by society. A very low number, 3%, and at the highest in 2011 it was 5%. I can put that into a little bit of context for you that that makes Indonesia slightly more accepting than Pakistan, Tunisia, and Nigeria, which are also in the single digits, but less accepting than Malaysia, China, and Korea, for example, other countries in the Asian region. A second study, effort to collect worldwide public opinion by the World Values Survey asks the question that's a little less abstract. It asks people whether or not they would be willing to have or would want to have a homosexual neighbor. In Indonesia in 2006, the last year this is available, 2/3 of Indonesians say they would not want a homosexual neighbor. So that's a fairly high percentage of people not wanting a homosexual neighbor in the global context. So we do have the best data that we have that's nationwide does suggest that there's considerable stigma attached to being homosexual in Indonesia. And really one way to frame our goal is to say we were looking for evidence that tells us about what effect that stigma has on LGBT people and then accordingly on the economy. So with that, I will transfer this over to Winston.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Winston, Research Associate at Williams Institute. Oops, sorry, I missed a slide. So in line with public opinion, which is also mostly negative, media portrayal of LGBT Indonesians is also generally negative. Some examples of how media portrayal is negative in Indonesia is some news agencies say in their news reports that homosexuality is immoral, homosexuality is not normal, it's against the laws of nature, or some more hardline Islamist newspapers would say that homosexuality is against Islamic beliefs. In accordance with what I said just now, there's numerous studies that show that this degree of harshness in their portrayal depends on where does the media agency stand in terms of like religious or ideological positions. Perhaps this kind of discriminatory portrayal by the media is perhaps legitimized by a statement released earlier in February 2016 by the Indonesia Broadcasting Commission, or GAYa, which stated in their press release to explicitly prohibit the broadcast of effeminate men and broadcast that quote-unquote campaign for LGBT people, whatever that means. And also, there's the fact that all these kinds of negative portrayals is actually against the non-discrimination or neutrality clause that is outlined inside the Indonesian Journalistic Code of Ethics, which is a bit strange. And also the fact that the Code of Ethics is actually outlined in a law which is enacted in 1999 and also adopted by the guidelines in the Journalistic Governing Body of Indonesia, means that this discriminatory portrayal is actually against probably the law. And then moving on to the specific terms that it's used to call SOGIE populations in Indonesia. There are Indonesia-specific gender terms. Perhaps the most common is called waria, which we use to refer to transgender women or male to female transgender. Waria is a portmanteau of wanita, which means female, and men, and pria, which means male. Waria is also referred by other more direct derogatory slang such as bentong, banti, and pentis. And these terms are usually used interchangeably to refer to either effeminate men, gay men, or men who exhibit unmasculine traits. In other cultures in Indonesia, such as the Bugis people, they may recognize more genders, such as Bugis people who recognize 5 genders. Until recently, usually people refer to LGBT population in general as just gay or homosexuals, but currently LGBT, the term, is now being widely used as an all-encompassing term for sexual and gender minorities. Violence is commonly reported by most LGBT Indonesians. In a survey released by Arus Pelangi a few years ago, and several studies published in Jurnal Perempuan, majority of LGBT surveyed experience violence some point during their lifetime. The majority of LGBT Indonesians experience psychological violence in the form of bullying, intimidation, and harassment, and usually these violence start very early in their life, sometimes as early as kindergarten. Other populations such as waria is especially vulnerable to physical and also sexual violence due to the nature of their usually informal work, such as in sex work. And also there's the fact that lesbian, bisexual women, and also transgender men are vulnerable to a specific type of sexual violence called corrective rape, in which families or close acquaintances of such women and transgender men subject them to rape in order to hopefully cure them of their either lesbianism, bisexualism, or transgenderism. We found several contributing factors as to why there's such a prevalent violence against LGBT people. First of all, is the absence of state protection in the shape of non-discrimination laws, and also it's pretty much exacerbated by the enactment of various discriminatory laws in various states and various counties. There's also a factor on the more individual level in the way that individual values and beliefs of Indonesians usually steep in patriarchy or deep religious beliefs give rise to vigilantism inside the community. These two forces can combine together, such as in the example of a law enforcement and militant groups join for violence against LGBTs. There are many reports of LGBT events being dismantled by the combined efforts of both the police and also militant Islamist groups. There are many downstream economic effects of violence. Perhaps the most visible example is this violence and harassment against LGBT Indonesians force LGBT Indonesians to quit school or their jobs early to avoid further harassment, or in the more personal level, it impacts their physical health and mental health, and also its violence and discrimination serves as a barrier for housing, transportation, and others. There's also healthcare barriers experienced by LGBT Indonesians, both from trying to get into the health system and while also in the health system. LGBT Indonesians are disproportionately highly affected by HIV. In some populations, such as waria, it's as high as 24%, and among MSM is 7.4%. This is high because the general populace of Indonesia only has a HIV prevalence rate of 3.5%. A lot of factors contribute to this, such as stigma against LGBT people, particularly waria and gay men. There's also violence, and also lack of knowledge, which lead to more risky health practices, such as intermittent condom use. And there's also the fact from the government that there's lower HIV funding for MSM than other key at-risk populations, such as female sex workers. On the mental health department, on the same Arus Pelangi study that examines violence, they report high levels of suicidal thinking and also attempts, and also high levels of drug abuse. And we also see LGBT Indonesians experience lower self-esteem. As I mentioned earlier, there's also healthcare barriers of getting into the system because of lack of ID cards. Lack of ID cards usually affect the warrior population because usually sometimes they don't have ID cards from their hometown because they try to avoid their hometown and move to the city. And also they don't have a city ID card while in the city due to fears from discrimination by the government. And there's also a problem while they are in the healthcare system in the form of discrimination by the health practitioners themselves. Some lesbian women report doctors and nurses sneering against them for being LGBT, and there's also reports of gay men being discriminated against or snubbed at because of their sexual orientation. As for the economic effect of healthcare barriers, we see higher healthcare costs, and also we see higher workplace absenteeism because they get sick and they don't want to get treated because of fear of harassment, which may result in lower productivity and thus result in the loss of human capital. And now I'm going to move on to Amira, who will discuss legal barriers, education, and employment.
So I'm going to talk briefly about legal barriers that exist and then talk a little bit more about education and employment and the barriers that exist there and how those can impact the economic output of the country.
And Amira, could you speak up?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Is this better?
Yes.
Okay. So we're going to start talking about the legal barriers. And on a nationwide level, there are no laws in Indonesia that actually criminalize LGBT people or criminalize homosexuality or cross-dressing. And in fact, there is a national non-discrimination law known as the Manpower Act that provides protections against employment discrimination. That act calls out specifically gender, ethnicity, race, religion, skin color, and political affiliation, but it does not explicitly identify protections for LGBT people. So there are, non-discrimination laws that theoretically could protect LGBT people, but in practice they don't actually do that. And then on local levels, there are localities that criminalize homosexuality. In Aceh, there's a law that actually punishes homosexuality with caning. And then there are other national barriers, even if they're not explicitly criminalizing LGBT people, they still create barriers. For example, same-sex couples are prohibited from adopting. Winston earlier mentioned ID cards and how hard it is to get access to health care without proper ID cards. ID cards in Indonesia are limited to only male and female gender markers, and in order to change that from one to the other, a person would have to have had gender-confirming surgery, which can be very expensive and hard to access. And also marriage is limited to different sex couples. So if we talk about educational challenges that LGBT people and people who are perceived as LGBT face in Indonesia, what we'll see is that this starts at a very early age and continues all throughout people's educational levels. And it may start at home or at school. It's very common for children who are gender nonconforming to be rejected by their families, whether that's just sort of punishment within the family or actual rejection and kicking out depends on the family. But for those kids or young adolescents who are kicked out of the home, it's much harder for them to access school. They may have to drop out to work to support themselves, or they may have challenges in terms of enrolling in school because if they don't have ID cards which come from their families, that can also be a challenge to remaining in school. And even for kids who are able to stay at home, if their family stops financially supporting their education, that can cause challenges in terms of accessing the education that they otherwise would be attending. Within the school context, it's very common that LGBT students or students who are perceived as LGBT experience harassment and bullying both by other students and by educators, and this has been found to happen at all levels of education, from young children all the way up through graduate school programs and professional programs. And Lee mentioned earlier that our studies are pretty limited, but from those that we saw with limited sample sizes, it did appear that GAYa have lower levels of education than MSM. And in terms of the economic effect of this, if you have to drop out of school, if you have fewer years of education, or even if you're in school but you're enduring a lot of harassment and discrimination, you're likely to have lower quality of education, and both of those are directly impacted to economic outcomes in terms of the quality of work that a person can attain later in life and their economic output. And if we look specifically at the employment context, we see that employment discrimination against LGBT people, gender nonconforming people, and people who are perceived as LGBT is very, very common. This can result in a lot of LGBT people ending up in the informal sector, whether that's sex work or self-employment or creative arts or salons. There's a lot of push out of the formal sector, and so it's more common than one might expect to see LGBT people in the informal sector. Some barriers to formal employment include lower education levels, like I just discussed. Again, difficulties with ID cards. If people don't have ID cards that match their gender expression, that can be a challenge in terms of looking for proper employment. Also, many employment postings will begin by seeking a healthy male or female. So for a person who is transgender, they may not identify as male or female, or they may know that the potential employer wouldn't identify them as male or female, and that may deter people from applying. Additionally, with the higher levels of HIV for LGBT people, as Winston mentioned earlier, that may be preventing people who don't identify as healthy or who may be perceived as unhealthy because of living with HIV. And it's not uncommon for people to have to go through health checks before they get officially hired for a job, and may come up during that health check. And that could be something that's stigmatizing and could cause barriers for people to be able to actually go through and attain that employment. Additionally, in interview processes, it's often common for gender nonconforming applicants to be discriminated against and to not be hired based on their gender expression. And even for people who do get into the workplace, there's often a lot of workplace harassment based on gender nonconformity. There was a study from the International Labor Organization that found that 65% of the respondents who they had interviewed who identified as non-LGBT reported being uncomfortable with an LGBT supervisor or coworker. So that's a very high number of people who are unlikely to be comfortable if you were out at work, and people are often forced further into the closet at work. They will sometimes have to, marry a different sex partner and have children to try to avoid any perception of being LGBT. And when that happens, then coworkers can sometimes continue to harass people, and if a person is fired for being LGBT or being perceived as LGBT, people often won't have any recourse because they're more afraid of their families finding out about it or of getting outed further. And obviously, if people, can't get access to jobs or are less productive at work because they're being harassed or distracted by all these other things, that's going to minimize economic output. So I'm going to hand it over back to Lee at this point.
Great, thank you. In trying to put this picture together, you can see there are many different pieces of it. And, of course, we would like to know, what if we could put all of them together? Is there a way to see quantitatively how much of a difference this makes economically? Let me just point out that a couple of years ago, we did a study with USAID, and in fact, one of the co-authors is on the call tonight, Yana Rogers, where we looked at 39 emerging economies, one of which was Indonesia, and we found a very strong correlation between the rights that a country offered to LGBT people and their level of GDP per capita, their gross domestic product per capita. That's kind of the overall measure of how much the economy is producing. So that correlation suggests that countries that have, fewer rights are also going to be held back, and that's basically consistent with what we've seen here. What we decided to try, in terms of estimating this larger cost, was to draw on yet another study that I did for the World Bank a few years ago in estimating the cost of exclusion in India. In that particular study, I found more studies, more quantitative studies that allowed me to be a little bit more precise in terms of being able to put a financial value on this exclusion, looking at lost productivity, which we can roughly measure as lost wages because of discrimination, looking at losses from health care because more people will have health conditions than would have them otherwise. So more people have serious depression, more people attempt suicide, more people have HIV than would otherwise happen if there were if we had a more inclusive society. There would be losses from reduced education, differences in output. We know occur for those who have different levels of education. So if we've got people with more education and there's less exclusion, we'll have higher output, and then the other way around where we have more exclusion. So overall, when I did this exercise for India, the estimate was that the loss was somewhere between 0.1% to 1.4% of GDP. If we took those same numbers for India, that same effect for India, and applied that to Indonesia and put this into dollars, it would be somewhere between almost $900 million to $12 billion a year in lost output for Indonesia. Now, the question is that reasonable to take a number that comes from India and also apply it to Indonesia? And here's our argument for thinking about this. We argued that it might actually be a conservative estimate, in other words, too low. For one thing, as we started out the webinar saying that Indonesian public opinion about homosexuality is much, much less accepting than in India. And that suggests that, if it's going to be different from India, it might actually be a much larger effect of exclusion. The other reasons that this might be a conservative estimate is because this also leaves out the effects of people who are not in the official economy. People who do unpaid labor in the home aren't counted in GDP. People who have disabilities that keep them from working would be counted. People who are in the informal sector might not be counted in these measures of GDP. So this loss could be even greater. And then finally, there are lots of other things that affect the economy. We're really just taking a particular viewpoint at a really more finely grained, detailed level, what economists would call the microeconomic level. But things like foreign investment and tourism might also be affected by the degree of inclusion or exclusion towards LGBT people. So overall, we think that this is, it's not a very precise estimate. We hope and think that this is also an argument for collecting more and better data on LGBT people in Indonesia, so that we can study what's happening in those contexts and do something about it, but also so that we could have better research into what these economic costs actually are overall. And with that, we will turn it over to Dédé and to Tunggal, for whom I also want to say thank you for being part of this webinar, but also for giving us helpful feedback on the study.
So Dédé and Tunggal, if you could press *7 to unmute, or...
Hello, this is...
Oh, good.
Hi.
Hi, take it
Hi,
away.
everyone. This is Dédé Oetomo in Surabaya, Indonesia. I agree with all the, situation that was reported by Lee, Winston, and Amira. For me, what has changed, especially since last year, was after the start of democratization in '98, we had hope that we could actually work through the democratic process in the different institutions of the state. Last year, we came to a rather bitter realization that it has to be postponed for many years to come. So now, just to be active as an organization is a problem. Economically, a lot of funding sources have been put under scrutiny. One, the UNDP, being LGBT in Asia, was stopped completely by the government, and the UN could not do anything about it. But also, international NGOs are under scrutiny. We've also learned lately that the penetration of the conservative Islamists or conservative other religionists is actually quite deep within the ministries, within the bureaucracy. So that means that work is becoming more difficult. I've actually had the thought, and this is just almost like thinking aloud, that maybe we should start thinking about direct funding from overseas instead of going through Indonesia, somewhere in Jakarta, in the capital. But that's something for a different conversation, I guess. But that's the realization we have now. Winston mentioned, the fact that if you plan an event, there is the risk of being disbanded by either the vigilantes or sometimes, or often actually, together with the police. And the police usually does not want to take the risk of protecting something that is unpopular. So that's another problem. Doesn't mean that we stop doing things, but it actually does put a damper on like many plans, and we do things virtually, which is okay. But so that's the situation right now. At the personal level, if you talk to people at different social classes, many would like to work overseas. A lot of Indonesians work as laborers in different countries, as household help. So we hear it anecdotally. We hear it more often, but also amongst more educated people. One solution is actually to move somewhere else. And I think this brain drain must cost something to the national economy. And so, this is my last statement. Listening to the conversation so far, what came to my mind is, what can we do, to do this? I mean, it seems it's going to be a long haul, but how do we start something? And just last remark. People mention research, but if you do research and you do it, and in some universities it's not even possible. When the university administration finds out that research is about sexuality or even sexual and reproductive health and rights, it might be banned. So this is certainly a challenge. I don't want to end on a pessimistic note, but it's the reality. Thank you.
Tunggal, are you able to get onto the call?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Okay. I'm Tunggal Pawestri. I'm they call me a women's rights activist. But I do have a concern on this issue. First, I would like to say thank you for Lee and the team for, because they already work hard to develop the study, although we know that it's very difficult to find the data. And I also would like to inform you that today actually we have Mike Pence here in Indonesia. So and we know the what they call we know the Sorry, can you hear me? Sorry, I think I lost it.
Yes, you're coming through very clearly.
Okay. And based on our conversation, I also would like to, just would like to make some comments that the strength of this paper, I just would like to say that all of the documentations of cases of LGBT discriminations is very good explained here. The paper also provides us with a very quite comprehensive documentations on the legal rules on employment and also the actual practices. I've been working for this issue for quite some time, and when we have to develop some things, when we need to make some projects on the LGBT issue, especially to handle or tackle discriminations and violence, we always have difficulty to find data. But Lee and the team, they have provided us with a very comprehensive data that most of the data, sometimes I never read the data. And I agree with Mas Dédé Oetomo when he mentioned that we do have problem in assessing some of the projects or programs, or when we would like to do something to intervene to dismantle the stigma or try to do something on the discrimination issue towards the LGBT. We always have problems on that. So I had this conversation with the economists last year, and we tried to explore much more information from the ground about the discriminations related to the economic issues. And we invited some of the white collars, can we call that, and the white collars and also the blue collars. And of course, the level of discriminations is different between those, The blue collars, they receive much more difficult situations on the ground, especially for for example, when within this paper, of course, the data, it's all based on the data, and much data only show about the transgender, the waria, the trans woman. But actually, if we would like to explore deeply, then we also can find more discriminations on the trans men. A lot of the trans men in the factory, working in a factory, and they face a lot of discrimination as well. But of course, we cannot find the data here because there's no organizations or the research institution who do who capture these issues on the ground. So this project, this effort to have a very comprehensive, to have this analysis on the economic exclusions against towards the LGBT is very good. But of course, I know as Indonesians, we really need to, make sure that we can push the government, our government, or the other research institutions to do much more to follow up this research. I think that's from me for now.
Thank you, Tunggal, and also thank you, Dédé and Amira and Winston and Lee. So I'd like to go to some questions, and so let's first take the question from Jane Miriam. Indonesia is a collectivistic culture, and family plays a part of the economy and one's economic capacity. So to what extent can we know about the economic cost of exclusion with regard to family in Indonesia?
Well, this is Lee. I can say something about that, I think that is a really important question, and it would be very interesting at some point, maybe not on this webinar, but I would be very interested in hearing more about your own research that led to this question. But I think, as Winston, I believe, was, or Amira were talking about educational challenges, a lot of those were related to families and the potential for a young person to be estranged from his or her family, and then losing financing for an education, losing sometimes even the ability to get an ID card because the family documents are, not accessible to them. It can lead to differences down the road in terms of, access to credit from family members. I mean, there are many ripple effects into the economy that can happen from the family's reaction and treatment of an LGBT person. And that's really just kind of the beginning. I mean, I think that to really understand that better, we would need to have the sort of in-depth ethnographic kind of research that I think you were hinting at in the chat box.
Thanks, Lee. And let me group a couple of questions together, which are questions about data. So can I ask, to the extent that you did find data, where was that data coming from and who were the folks doing those studies? And if you were to have a research agenda in Indonesia, what kind of data would you need and want to gather?
Well, actually, maybe either Winston or Amira want to talk about that first question about who conducted the studies that we were looking at.
Surely. I can comment on mostly the studies that are conducted in Bahasa Indonesia. So some of them are undergraduate or graduate thesis work done in universities, because in Indonesia, undergrads are also required to submit a thesis as a prerequisite to graduation and graduate school. That's pretty much standard almost around the world. So that's one source. And then we also have another source of various public health or ethnographic articles published by local journals in Indonesia. Some of them, I think most of them are mostly accredited, and some of them are mostly just locally accredited but not internationally accredited. And then we also have articles from online databases of journals that are also in English. But I think Amira has more on that. So Amira?
Yeah, I would just add to that we did the online research just like you were discussing, and we also found
a little louder, Amira.
Oh, sorry. We also found some helpful data coming from UNDP, the International Labor Organization, and other large, outside multinational human rights organizations that were helping to fund some of that research.
And so thinking about what kind of data we would need to make a more precise calculation, I'm going to say something that's going to sound like a total fantasy, but, even economists can have fantasies. That is, data that is, from a representative sample of LGBT people and of non-LGBT people. It would be data that would actually, if we're going to just make this, really aspirational, that might include measures of sexual orientation, of gender identity and expression, and even would allow us to identify people who think of themselves as intersex. And we could compare people's level of education to those of other people with similar characteristics who are not LGBTI. We could compare their health status. We could compare the kinds of jobs that they have to see if there are differences in the lived experience for LGBTI people and non-LGBTI people, and try to understand why those differences exist. I mean, most of the time, given other evidence of exclusion and stigma, we think that that's highly likely to be the kind of thing that we talked about tonight, which is, discrimination and harassment in the workplace and educational settings, et cetera. So, but that would give us the ability to have, a more precise understanding of how big those differences are. And that's really the key question for trying to measure the economic impact.
And if
actually, I was just going to say, so I did say that was a fantasy, but it's not a crazy fantasy because, so different parts of the world, some countries are starting to actually collect that kind of data. We're finally starting to do a little bit of that in the U.S. We see that happening in Canada and Australia and the U.K. and occasionally in other countries. So it is possible to do that.
And let me ask other people if they want to unmute by pressing *7, they can jump in. There was a question, I think Stephen asked, can you talk about the weakness of the 0.1 to 1.4 estimate from India? So I think maybe address the comfort with borrowing those numbers from India.
Yeah. Well, I think the weaknesses. I mean, it was an exercise and just trying to see if some pieces of this could be estimated, and then once you estimate them, you can add them up. But the underlying things that I think could be improved with better data and more research would be to have a better idea of what the wage gaps are in India between LGBTI people and non-LGBTI people. It would mean having a much broader knowledge about what health disparities exist. So I could only identify them in three areas, but there are lots of different healthcare conditions that people might have that could be different. Actually, that estimate doesn't include anything about losses from reduced education because there just wasn't a good quantitative basis or any quantitative basis, even an okay or pretty good kind of quantitative basis to draw on there like there were for healthcare. But we definitely, in India, there is, as in Indonesia, there is evidence that people face harassment and bullying and that they may have a lower quality of education and fewer years of education, and those are the things that will also have economic costs. So there's, it's a very incomplete look, but here's the thing. It only captures a few pieces, and it's still a big number. I mean, 0.1% to 1.4%, they don't sound like big numbers, but that they're meaningful losses to the economy that could have been, distributed to many people, in that economy, and made a lot of people better off if output had been higher. So it shows that even with a very imperfect way of measuring it, we still see that it is meaningful.
And then let me ask also for Dédé and Tunggal, how do you think that this information can be used with the government? And let me interject that we've sent copies of this study to the Minister of Finance, both in her office in Jakarta and at the meeting that she's currently attending this week in Washington, D.C. And we don't know if they've been read or received. But what's the next step in terms of using this to influence the government?
Well, that will be great, if we want to have if we can also influence the government. But at this point of time, I don't know, I just feel pessimistic, that this growing conservatism, we can use this moment to influence the government positions on the LGBT. But of course, as a community, we will try to educate ourselves. We will try to study this research and then try to develop a very valid argument on, because we can use this as a basis for our advocacy. Some of my friends, the LGBT groups, they already try to make intervention in the health ministry and also in the the manpower ministry. So hopefully by having this study, it will help us to foster the advocacy or strengthen our advocacy. Yeah.
Hi, this is Dédé. I was hoping Tunggal would be more optimistic, but
not this time, but probably.
I know.
Yeah.
It's okay. But I think something that will be two things. Number one is we have to identify through either the Williams Institute or maybe Winston also knows people in Indonesia who are trusted economists, people who are respected economists. And if we could actually, instead of directly to the finance minister, if she's willing, it's fine, but somebody who could actually listen to activists and then be convinced to be an ally in this field of this endeavor, and then maybe they can talk to the finance minister people. That's one way of I can think we need to do work on. The second thing is I think for the this is for many activists even this is new, the economic aspect of LGBT exclusion. So I think I'm glad Tunggal is on the line. So we should actually talk about how do we summarize in a more simple way, maybe an executive summary with a few graphics in Indonesian to be used by local activists, and we could do discussions at the different organizations. Yeah. So those are the two things that I could see, as first steps in this work. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I agree with Pak Dédé that we also need to get some feedback and also input from the economists, the expert. Like for example, in the beginning of this project or this study, I asked some of my friends who are economists, and they're quite open-minded, and they gave inputs, very well input. And so we can start by having them perhaps as an allies for this, and then perhaps asking them on how to, use the data to do this policy advocacy. Yeah.
May I chime in? I have a suggestion, perhaps. This is Erin Doss from USAID's Regional Development Mission in Bangkok. Hi, Dédé. One thing I was reading recently in terms of kind of persuasion, right? This idea of social proof, and that effective social proof can help persuade to say, oh well, look what others are doing. I was thinking that maybe framing the argument not only in the economic cost, so I think that's persuasive. Psychologically, I think studies show that. Well, I was like, oh, you shouldn't. There's a sign in a national park that says, oh, people litter and this causes damage. Then what actually happens is people think, oh, well, there's a lot of people littering. It's okay for me to do it. Just one more piece of trash. Whereas if you frame it in a positive way, I think the speakers talked about the studies where it showed positive correlation with higher GDP if it's a pull factor with government leaders or nearby countries that are more inclusive, where it's making a difference for the economy, say the tourist economy in Thailand maybe. Their policies have compromised too. But if there's a way to show a positive reason rather than a negative reason, the studies I've seen have suggested that might actually be more persuasive.
Those are all very useful and very interesting. And whoever just talked last, I don't know who that was, but we're going to find you.
Just Erin Doss out of USAID in Bangkok.
Oh, okay, great. So we've reached the end of our time, and I want to thank everybody. We're going to follow up with a couple of people that have exchanged emails during the session, and then if anybody listening wants to follow up with any of the speakers, you should feel free, and you can get in touch with them through basically anybody. We'll trade emails very easily. And so that's it. And thank you, everybody, for attending this, and we look forward to more discussions just like this one.
Say Andrew, this is
Yes.
Cliff Cortez from the World Bank. Can I say one thing,
Cliff.
if you don't mind? Sure.
Oh, please.
Absolutely. I just wanted to note for folks listening to the conversation here, I just wanted to note for folks that although it's a little removed from trying to get where we all want to be ideally, the fantasy of the economist, as Lee said, for Indonesia, I just want to note that the spring meetings for the World Bank are going on, the annual spring meetings right now, and we got on the official agenda a session that is about SOGI and exclusion. And so we are going to be using that platform to get into the discussion, at least among the finance ministers who are here for the spring meetings, the notion that there in fact is an economic cost to homophobia and transphobia. And we're going to lay out for them why we think that's the case. And of course, the big theme is we need more data, and the World Bank is going to try to help to get that data where we're allowed to, of course, because our clients are the governments. So I just wanted folks to know that that's something that's happening now in Washington during these World Bank spring meetings, and we'll just go from here.
Thank you very much for that, Cliff, and thank you for the effort. Okay, I think that's it for tonight. Have a good evening, or I guess day, for those of you on the other side of the date line. And goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.